everyone. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to go through the lesson plan format. I think that going through the format will help you as you go into your student teaching and use lesson plans for your EdTPA. So these are the lesson plans, the same format that you're going to use for your EdTPA. And it's important to know all of these components really well so that it'll just make it easier when you're submitting this stuff for your EdTPA later. Before we start, the first thing to keep in mind is that in these classes, like in Lisa's class and in my class, you're writing your own lessons. You're creating your own lessons. And I know we've talked about this in class, but remember that when you get into your student teaching experience, you will likely be using purchased curriculum from the district. So commercially available curriculum that they've purchased. And so it will have a lot of the activities already planned out. What it will not have are some of these more nuanced things that involve your critical thinking. So like adaptations and modifications, understanding how to incorporate cognitive pieces like self-reflection into it, all that kind of stuff you're going to have to augment on your own. So that's why it's important to become familiar with the steps so that when you take a boxed curriculum lesson, you're able to adapt it to fit into this sort of format. And that's why on this form there's a space for the source. So let's just get started and see kind of what you put in each one of these categories. And I am aware that you guys have written a lot of lesson plans already for this class, so you still have one left, and so this will be helpful for your last one, but should in no way make you feel like you did your first 4 wrong or anything, because they've been looking really good. All right, so starting, you would put your name and the grade of the children that you are going to be delivering the lesson to, and then the discipline. And here you could just put math, or you could put, here you would just put math. The central focus of the lesson is just sort of like the general definition of what you're going to be doing. So you might start by putting, if it's going to be algebraic thinking or numbers and operations, you might say numbers and operations, and then sort of a quick couple of words about what within numbers and operations you're going to be focusing on. The lesson overview is really an abbreviated version of that part 2. So part 2, because this whole thing is part 1, or section 1, it says overview. And then section 2, down here, are the lesson events. So this is where you go step by step of what exactly you're going to do. So this might be like the script that you write for yourself, the steps you're going to carry out with the kids, all that stuff. Up here in the lesson overview is just a few sentence overview of what that is. I'm going to have kids take cotton balls and weigh them, and also weigh some rocks and compare the weights. That might be something like that in order to blah, 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 blah. So just kind of like an overview of what the activity is, maybe how you're going to assess them, that sort of thing. The model of delivery is how you're going to be delivering your lesson. So if it involves a hands-on component, if it involves direct instruction, if it involves small group, that sort of stuff is how you are delivering the lesson. Like if I were going to say how I'm delivering the lesson in our class, I might say a lecture, because in college classes we often have lectures. So that might be a direct instruction. Here, the source is if you obtained your lesson from a boxed curriculum. So that's the name of the curriculum, the publisher, you're giving them credit. So you're making sure that they know. Now in our class, I'm asking you guys to think up your own stuff. But remember, when you're out in the district, you're going to be modifying a lot of lessons. The standard is where you plug in the specific standard of what you're doing. And so let's just take a minute to make sure we know exactly what that is. So under mathematics standards, you are going to be looking at the content standards. And you're going to not look at standards for mathematical practice, not the introduction, but starting with the grades, you can look at the different content standards. And for us, the only ones that are relevant are kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. So let's choose one from grade 1. And then here we have all our different areas of mathematical content. And I might choose measurement and data for grade 1. And under measurement and data, I peruse to see which content area I want to teach to when I'm developing a lesson of my own. When you're using a boxed curriculum and modifying a boxed curriculum lesson, you're going to see that they'll have put it in there already for you. But for my content standard, this, like the first one, is order 3 objects by length, compare the lengths of 2 objects indirectly by using a third object. So I would take this, this whole standard, if I can highlight it. This whole standard here, that's what I'm going to plug in to my lesson plan here. So that's what the standard is. Then you're going to write some objectives. And these are the objectives that you are planning to teach to with a child. So let's say if I'm going to do this, my standard is order 3 objects by length. That's the first part. Compare the lengths of 2 objects indirectly by using a third object. So this is for first graders. So since there are 2 parts to this standard, I'm going to go ahead and write 2 objectives that match perfectly onto the standard. So I'm going to say, I need to use learning objectives or learning outcomes. And I want to use the right language when I'm doing learning outcomes. One way that I can do that is thinking about Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a list of verbs that have to do with learning. I'll show it to you. So this version came from Vanderbilt University Center for Teaching. They've got a really good program for higher ed teaching. So they've done the traditional sort of pyramid that starts at the bottom, which is sort of the most rudimentary level of learning, and goes all the way to the top, which is the most sophisticated level of learning. So like remembering something is easiest, let's say, cognitively. And some of the verbs that go along with that are define, duplicate, list, memorize, repeat, or state. Next, the next level is understanding, because that's a little bit harder for your brain to do, right? So you're going to classify, describe, discuss, explain, identify. Look at all these great rich verbs in here. These are what you use to write outcomes or learning objectives, are these sort of Bloom's taxonomy words. So when I want those kids to be able to, let's see, what does my standard say? Order the objects by length. I think that's classify, because they're going to understand that some are shorter and some are longer. So I'm going to use the word classify in there. I like that. Classify 3 everyday objects in order of length. Or we could just make it concise, by length, just like the standard says. So that's one objective. I want them to be able to classify those 3 everyday objects by length. The second thing I want them to do, and this standard's kind of easy because I feel like the content objectives are really sort of there in the standard. Sometimes you have to think a little bit harder to see what sort of verb you're going to use. But I'm going to say compare the lengths of 2 objects to determine the length. Compare 3 objects to determine the length by using third object. These are very close to the standard, but that's okay. You're rewriting the standard and you really want to know what you want the kids to be able to walk away with. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. And for this particular standard that I just randomly chose, it makes it a little easy because the standard is kind of written in objective language already. All right, so for the language demand, this is kind of the most confusing part. And this is one of the things that they look for on your EdTPA lesson plans. And you don't necessarily need to always have both syntax and discourse, but you always need to have vocabulary. So it's important to just cover all 4 so that you know your bases are covered. That's what I think. So there's a, excuse me, a good document that I uploaded into your resources that explains all 4 of these, and I'm just going to pull that up now. So it's right in here under modules and under resources, And I think these three are all sort of about that, but the best one I think is the EdTPA language for math. So this doc explains the EdTPA language for math, and you can read it in your own time, but what I will scroll down to is, here's where they say, not all tasks focus on both discourse and syntax, are the definitions. So it really goes through each one. So it says, all right, for vocabulary, and here's an example, functions, language function. Oh, it starts with function, good. So language function, which is out of order from your lesson plan, talks about the purposes for which language is used, the active verbs within the learning outcomes. So remember, those are the active verbs that you got from the Bloom's taxonomy. You're talking about why these kids or why this language helps their learning. And so then you can rewrite your learning objective. Here's why. And you really just kind of rewrite your learning objective, sort of. Second one is vocab. This one I think you guys have done a really great job on. It seems pretty straightforward. This is the academic vocabulary that's related to math. So if they're also using cotton balls for their math activity, cotton balls isn't going to be a part of the vocabulary. Even if they don't know that word yet, that's not what you're focusing on. You're focusing on the math academic language. So here you can see it says subject specific. Subject specific meanings that might differ from like what they mean in everyday life. So like with compare, you might think about compare like I might compare how much I like peas and how much I like carrots. That's sort of a different definition of compare than I'm going to compare the lengths of two objects, right? So it has to be within that mathematics subject specific meaning. And then they give some examples of how, what those words might be. Compare, analyze, numerator, denominator, yada, yada, yada. All right, discourse are how the members of the discipline talk, write, participate in the knowledge. This is going to be how the children are able to communicate about the content. So it should be subject specific about the content. And it can be oral or it can be written. And here they give some examples of how it's going to be. Maybe kids might restate what's going on. Maybe they might look at a graph and tell you what's going on with the graph. Maybe they might talk to you about their work. And then the last one is syntax. Syntax usually goes with English language arts, so I can see how it's confusing to translate it into math. But the main function of syntax is organizing your language to convey meaning. And this can mean a lot of things in math. So they've given you 3 really solid examples here. Mathematical sentences, so using words and symbols like this. 6 is greater to or equal than 4. Greater than or equal to 4. Noun phrases that have to do with your math lesson, or conditional sentences. This could also mean, and they don't put this on here, like a table or a tool or some sort of structured thing that you use. So if you have kids enter values into a table, that's also syntax. If you have them develop a graph, that's also syntax. So peruse this document, take a look at it, see how it helps you when you are going through those 4 language supports. All right, so then your student-friendly objectives are the I cans. So it's really just your learning objectives from up here, written in language that you know the kids are going to understand without necessarily having to teach them all the new vocabulary. Next box is your assessment indicators. So how are you going to assess them with a pre-test, how are you going to assess them during, and how are you going to assess them with a post-test. This can be a combination of formal or informal assessment. I'm not going to go into great detail with this because you guys have had a whole class about this. But you know what I mean when I say assessment. The evaluative tool you're going to use might be a worksheet, it might be a checklist, some way that you're going to evaluate them. Then you're going to go into data analysis. So how are you going to look at this data and analyze whether or not children have met the outcome or met your learning objectives, or both? So exactly how you're going to analyze the data. I'm going to look at a worksheet where there are 10 questions, and if kids got 10 out of 10, then I know that they will have mastered the material. That's an example of what you would say. All right, this video is about to end because I only get 15 minutes, so tune into the next video.